Welcome you all to CSIS this afternoon for what I think is going to be a very interesting and also a lively discussion. My name is Reed Hamill. I'm a senior fellow with the Global Food Security Project here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And it's my pleasure to also welcome and to introduce author Lisa Palmer today. Lisa is a senior fellow for socio-environmental understanding at the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center in Annapolis. Her work has appeared in a wide array of high-profile publications, the New York Times, The Guardian, Nature Climate Change, and you can read more about her work and her background on the bio sheet passed out. Lisa and I first met a couple of years ago at the Wilson Center, where we were both in residence, so thank you to the Wilson Center. And it wasn't quite by accident, because when I found out that she was there, I made sure to track her down. And that was because Lisa had published a piece a couple of years before that, or I guess a year before that, in Slate called Famine is a Feminist Issue. And I used to assign that piece to my undergraduate students. So I think in both that work and in the book we're here to discuss today, Lisa really demonstrates such a knack for pulling together very, very complex issues across disciplines and making them accessible to a broad and general interest audience. It's an enviable skill. So today's focus is not on famine, but I think that we would be remiss not to keep close in mind the connections between longer-term food security interventions, system change, and the types of shorter-term acute responses that sort of go hand in hand with them, particularly in this moment where we see 4 ongoing famines in the world today affecting about 30 million people. To put that in some perspective, with my demographer's prerogative, that's about the population of Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. combined, and then doubled. So it's a lot of people. But today's focus is on Hot, Hungry Planet, Lisa's new book, just published earlier this month. Hot, Hungry Planet confronts food security on a planet where we're seeing greater and greater consumption demands on our strapped agricultural systems, and at the same time, a planet where the climate is getting hotter and drier and more volatile every year. So the stakes are high and the time is short. This is not an issue that we can kick down the road for another generation. As I said, Lisa has this great ability to balance reams of data and statistics and cutting-edge scientific research with that human element, that personal narrative. She has a journalistic flair for storytelling that really draws the reader very quickly through this book, threading a tale from Colombia to Uganda to climate change, climate-smart villages in India, and then bringing it back to the United States and looking at a young farmer in Iowa and how he's doing things a little bit differently. So it's a great read. And for such a heavy topic, this is also a pretty optimistic read. And the reason for that is that we know a lot of solutions to the problems that are facing us today. What we lack is the political will and the resources to scale those solutions up. So if you don't yet have a copy of the book and would like one, we do have some available for sale today as well, and I know that Lisa would be happy to sign any copies. So in Washington, we often talk about food security as a bipartisan issue, and it absolutely is, and thank goodness for that. But I think really food security is a nonpartisan issue. Occurrences of famine and starvation, they elicit a nearly universal human response, a visceral response. And I frankly think that universality is something that we could better capitalize on. So food and nutrition security are human rights, but they are also, and no less, a savvy economic investment and a sound business case with a very high rate of return. Moreover, investing in global food security is an unassailable national security strategy for the United States. And so all these incentives, they align very well, and the US government has shown a great deal of leadership and commitment to the challenges that we face, including nearly $1 billion in the omnibus spending bill for famine relief. But budget proposals from this administration demonstrate its resolve to drastically shrink U.S. government resources going forward, both for acute and for longer-term food security investments. And that's alarming. It would be a great shame, both because of the progress that we've made, but it would also just be deeply shameful. And so I'm heartened to see the turnout today for that reason. It's a very salient topic at an important time. We're going to start by hearing from Lisa about the advent of this project and the journey along the way and some of the discoveries along that path. And then we really look forward to a conversation with all of you. And I hope that everyone can also join us for a reception after that conversation. If you're joining us online, thank you. We will not be able to take questions from our online audience, but we do hope that you join the conversation via Twitter. You can find us at #HotHungryPlanet, #CSISLive, and I think that Lisa and I are also both pretty easy to track down on Twitter. So with that, Lisa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for being here today. Hello to everybody. I wanted to talk a little bit about my book. And some stories in the book, and I'm happy to answer some questions that you have. In Hot Hungry Planet, I take readers on a global journey to some of the places, to the farms and communities, and into the minds of researchers and people who think deeply on this subject of food security. And I did this because I wanted to shine a focus on something that I thought is of vital interest to me, but also from around the world. I saw a lot of interest from a variety of groups and people working on this from multiple perspectives. And so I wanted to bring this together in a single volume where you can see some of these potentially hopeful solutions that are happening on the ground. I think it's always a good reminder to understand sort of what's going on here. So why is this important? Well, we all need to eat, but also more particularly, for most of our existence, human populations have been relatively small, and the world, the planet has been relatively large in proportion. 1 billion people were living on Earth when the 19th century turned into the 20th century, and today there are 7 billion of us. All right, and this is hurtling towards 9 to 10 billion at current projections by the middle of the century. And so achieving a global food security amid this changing global environment where we have increasing world population that's hungering for a more diverse and protein-rich diet, there'll be a great generational challenge of our time. And so with this, I couldn't stop thinking about this, what are these 2 billion extra people in the world rolled by climate change, and really we have no idea how we're going to provide them with sufficient and sustainably clean energy, food, and water. And so, I feel that this is a challenge that's on a scale that requires, government, academia, business, and ordinary people to want to solve it. And so I went out in the field to look for some of these hopeful stories. And so my goal in writing Hot Hungry Planet was to make these complex stories come alive. Oop, that's not working. Down. I grew up in Minnesota, and I reflect back from my childhood. The area where I grew up is very flat. There are people that raise soybeans and corn and feed corn for cattle, and actually right now there are wind farms that are huge and successful wind farms across the area of southern Minnesota and northern Iowa that are also supplementing the income of farmers. So I tell the stories from a variety of perspectives, and I focus on 3 key concepts in them: the social and educational and agricultural advances, and especially focus on women. And you'll see that the gender component be a strong focus woven throughout the book. I focus also on the land use and technical actions by farmers, and then the policy nudges that might have the potential to reduce some of the adverse environmental impacts of agriculture while providing more food. Wrong way, here we go. So, the global food and nutrition security, as Reed pointed out, is really in America's national security and economic interests. And it's a very complex story. And the complexity has to do with sort of this convergence of climate change and a variety of global environmental changes on one side of the equation. And then we have, on the other side, this growing world population that's hungering for a more diverse and protein-rich diet. And so this all has a cascade of effects in how we use the land, in our oceans, and with agricultural production. I went around the world and I met a variety of people and talked to them. And this is Fabiola Vega. I met with her when I was in India. She changed, she provided some compelling evidence, along with several other people that I met using a similar system. People were trying to produce more food per acre of land. And she was trying to sustainably intensify her production and sort of while also weathering climate change. And she was able to do so by making the changes pay off remarkably fast. She lives in the hilly Cauca region of Colombia. And she had produced coffee for years, but after, when it was being affected by the high temperatures, increasingly high temperatures, as well as more intense and unpredictable rainfall. And it made it almost impossible for her to achieve the yields that she needed. And so to cover her costs, she realized that she had to change her system. So she switched to some more shade-grown coffee, which was able to temper. So she had a mixed plantain and coffee system. And then she used part of her land for raising cattle for dairy production. And she did so because she was able to use it to raise them, to grow all of the inputs basically for her cattle through a sustainable system called silvopastoral grazing, where it's more of a vertical grazing system with shrubby trees and I don't know if there's a picture of it in here, with shrubby trees and leguminous shrubs where the cattle eat, and it's devised in a way that works with them nutritionally, as well as the breed of cattle that she was raising, and doing so in a way where she didn't have to put a lot of, spray her fields with certain chemicals in order to make the grasses grow, which a lot of farmers do. And I think that the area there, the reason I was focusing on that, because a lot of the cattle production had been disseminated by these longer droughts. The grasses weren't growing, and the heat was so intense that the cattle were not able to produce milk. And so having a more shaded system provided them with so this more shaded system provides the cattle with shade, intensive grazing, and provides her with another income source. She was so successful, she was able to have her son move back to the farm, which was pictured in the previous slide, and he had previously moved to Spain for work. So he had moved back to Colombia, as well as her grandson who had moved to the city. And so they were able to really provide a source of income and hope for that family. So I went to India and I covered the Climate Smart Villages there. The Climate Smart Villages program looks at a variety of ways that farmers throughout India can not only reduce the amount of emissions that comes from agriculture and reduce the amount of water used in agriculture and reducing the amount of fertilizers, but also improve and increase their resilience to climate as well as increase their food security. One of the stories particularly I visited with some farms in rural Gujarat, and this is a picture of from there. I met with the farmers there who were selling who were working with a program to have solar panels installed on their irrigation system so that they could be incentivized to reduce their water consumption, because overpumping of groundwater is one of the most significant problems in that area and most significant factors for food security. And so the government is looking for ways to incentivize them to use less water, but also provide an income through this solar system to be fed back into the grid. And so depending on how much water that the farmers use, and there you can see, and there's a pipe in the background there where the water is being pumped out. And there are the solar panels, and there is just one of the outbuildings of his farm. They're using a variety of technologies and measurements to be able to make sure that the farmers are using less inputs, and even being able to seed the crops directly into the soil, which means that they're not burning the crop residue, but while also increasing the amount of organic matter in soils to be able to absorb water. So, throughout the world, I focused on a variety of systems, and I think one of the more hopeful systems that I found was, and I'm going back here, in western Uganda. I talked with girls at a high school that they're enrolled in, and the high school is focused, and it's also associated with an African Rural University for Women. It's a women's only agricultural school and university that prepares them for rural development jobs and agricultural work, which is also trying to reduce the trend towards increasing one's education, which means that when they are increasing their education, they're often moving to the cities for jobs. So they're able to increase their education while also remaining in the rural areas by helping other women. So it's based on the notion of land-grant schools, and in the United States, where the graduates work for rural transformation and deliver knowledge to the people in their community. And it also has this co-learning component where the families go through a series of homework with the students on their breaks, since they're required to do so as part of their education. And it's definitely a capacity building element to the program, especially for the mothers who then can learn some of the concepts and tools, and even find out, and be able to secure land rights to the farms that they farm. The book is fairly concise, and as Reed pointed out, that I try to break down this all these difficult problems through case studies, and I end with some hopeful stories from the American Midwest. The stories are all over the globe and all around us, really. And I think improving the livelihoods of smallholder producers, as we all know, while promoting agricultural productivity, will be essential in the future for us. And I think that I wrote the book because I believe that governments and academics and businesses and ordinary people should put the global food security issues front and center, and it should make it a priority to have it on the agenda. And the book was to be able to engage more people in this discussion. So I think that's about it. I have to, of course, thank my many funders who provided me with grants for travel and for providing me with interpreters and people to take me to the different places around on the ground. So thank you. And
great. No, great. That's a wonderful overview. Thank you so much. So I want to make sure we have lots of time for conversation, but I'm going to start and jump in first. So as I mentioned, I was trained as a demographer, so steeped in Malthusian misery and Paul Ehrlich's population bomb that predicted mass starvation in the 1970s with polemical certainty, some would say. And that didn't happen for a whole host of reasons. But I do think that a common misconception really does persist, that population growth constitutes the most significant threat to global food security today. Is it a factor? Absolutely. But your book does a good job dispelling this myth. with in its kind of crude form. So as you said, we expect to see a couple more billion people on the planet in the coming decades, about a 25% increase. But at the same time, global agricultural forecasts frequently call for a doubling of production over that same period. And so what accounts for that difference, as you explained very clearly, is the composition of the average diet rather than the number of people consuming it. And primarily, of course, the shift towards more animal-sourced foods as countries grow wealthier. So I'm curious, as you traveled around the world and you talked to so many people, government leaders, a broad swath of industry, how much these concerns about resource intensity really do come up in lower and middle income countries, this focus on shifting diets of a population that's growing richer. Does that case resonate in these contexts, or does it just sound like wealthy countries telling poor countries that they can't eat how we eat?
Well, I think there are a couple of different trends that are important to remember and to note. One is that, I think that the people that I've talked to about the U.S. population is that our consumption of meats is sort of softening a little bit, but also that countries around the world are looking a lot more smarter at the way that they raise food intensively. They're looking at ways to not only, and that's why I brought up the silvopastoral grazing system, because they're looking at ways to have some meat and dairy production on their farms through various livestock, but be able to have them in a more intensive and sustainable system. So they can have them in smaller plots of land and feed them with what they grow on their properties, but while also have more vertically grown beans, for instance, or other things that they grow on the properties. So they're looking in a very realistic way of what their population needs. And I think that the answer to that really changes wherever you go around the world, because culturally people eat different types of food. So in Rwanda, cattle, there's a strong sort of cultural background in that. But another important piece to this is looking at the nutritional component of people who eat and rely on wild-caught fish, right? So, and around the world, the declines, they're looking at specific declines in fish availability for some of these people who look at fish as their major source of some micronutrients and protein. So, it changes throughout the world.
Absolutely. You also give a lot of great examples on the role of good governance and emphasize the catalytic role that good governance can play in coaxing along the types of systems changes that you describe in various contexts. Can you give us a couple additional examples of things you observed and maybe also some worst case scenarios, if you have any?
I had talked to some people who are working in Uruguay, for instance, and I was really quite impressed by how they were looking at soil and having a sustainable soil management plan for each of the farms. The governance there, I think that they were looking at just having these soil management plans being required is just how they had set up the system. And they're also dialed into technology and making sure that if farmers are watering their cattle in a certain area, and yet that area is getting low on water, they can help direct them to different areas. I mean, there's a variety of things that there's high tech involved. I think that having some of the policies that I saw around the world to support some of these smallholder efforts, like in this Climate Smart Villages program, where they looked at more of a landscape approach versus a single intervention, like, we need to grow one thing. That's not going to happen if there's not a market for it, and the farmer doesn't know what to do with it. So, I think that there's a little bit of room for improvement in many places. I know that some researchers that I talked to in the Borlaug Institute of South Asia, north of Delhi, right on the Punjab border, I think I had a slide on that, had issues around they were doing some test plots for maize because they realized that it's really not going to be sustainable there to grow rice in the future. And so policies around how they're going to make that transformation, how they'll have new markets, and that'll be really interesting to see how that and if that unfolds the way that they're thinking. But there are some big system-wide changes that will need to be in place, and the policies will need to be there to guide that.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to make sure we have lots of time for questions, so I'm still going to ask just one more, and then we'll get to the audience. So bringing it back to the American interest, I guess, because these aren't just global issues, these are local issues, and I really like that you weave these threads back and forth throughout the book. You talked with a lot of people writing this book, and one of them was Emmy Simmons, who is an advisor to our program here at CSIS. And she told you about the disconnect between the American farming community and the rest of the world. So she says in your book, quote, "What US-based thinkers think domestically and do domestically, and what's happening in the rest of the world are separate dialogues," unquote. So she says that American farmers are convinced that they are feeding the world, but that is just not the case. So how can we make these global issues more salient and relevant to our audience at home, to our stakeholders at home, the American agricultural community, as well as, of course, the policy environment? In your last chapter, you visit this great farm, which you referenced in your presentation in Iowa, where that farmer is managing an integrated system with about 1 cow per acre in a region characterized by massive feedlots, right, with over 100 cattle per acre in many cases. And so that's more efficient. The integrated systems are more efficient than the free-range pasture grazing, but they can't compete with the volume of meat coming off of these feedlots, and particularly if we don't factor in or value the usage of water. So how do we start to change that mental math where we do kind of internalize the externalities? How do we help American farmers and other stakeholders really better factor in sustainability?
Well, that's an easy question.
Easy question.
So I think the main point in that, with that conversation, is that I think that people will begin, and this will be becoming more as ordinary people get involved in understanding how complex this is, as well as the policy nudges in moving in the right direction. I think people will begin to expect that their food will be not only nutritious and healthy, but also sustainable, just as much as right now that they expect our food to be safe. You go into the grocery store and you buy something, you expect it to bring home to be safe. Right now we have various kinds of labeling, and but we expect it to be safe. I believe that it's also going to be an added thing in the future where we'll have expectations to have our food to be produced sustainably without having overuse of resources, or having our resources being compensated as a result.
So you think this is really a demand-driven pivot in the United States? It sounds like it. I mean, we see this underway.
Yeah, I think we're seeing some of the changes, and the people that I've talked to, the people working in food policy domestically, as well as the people who are looking at, and the food scientists, are also looking at this in that way.
Good. Well, I'm glad to hear they're thinking about it. I want to turn to the audience. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for a mic to make its way to you so that our online listeners can also hear. If you don't mind introducing yourself and keeping your question brief so that we can just get to as many as possible, that would be wonderful. Oh, and also it would be easier for our mic runners to see you if you stand up, apparently. Or raise your hand to start. Any questions? Yes.
Hi, I'm Dan Silverstein. You talked about the catalytic role of government in better decision making. I'm interested to know, when you talk with senior government officials, ministers, et cetera, do you get a sense from them that they are seriously integrating the various aspects of better business practices, including, say, transparency, mutual accountability, a better enabling environment, things like that? Mm-hmm. Or is it just talk?
I'm seeing a lot more interest, and I'm also seeing it activities on the ground for technology to play a big role in that, and integrating ideas around sourcing, looking at the supply chains. That's a big issue, and I think that that's where we're going to see a lot of these big systems changing. We're seeing some of it in the palm oil supply chain, where these big businesses are having that kind of effect on palm oil. We're also seeing it in the soy production, and that's increasing. I know a handful or more research teams that are also working with people in big business and policy, working on these, trying to look at these questions together in a holistic way. I also just recently learned, and you may be aware of it, there's a new consortium of business leaders and government leaders and researchers that are looking at these research questions about how to provide food security and nutrition in a more sustainable way. That just got underway, I think launched this week. I have the media advisory with me. It was in my backpack on the way here. So that, I feel that there's a strong movement moving in this direction, and technology is going to play a role in that.
Thank you. Other questions? Over here, the lady in green.
Yeah, my name is Karen. So technology, back in the 60s meant, manipulation of the seeds, to improve the yields. Genetic modified foods is another area. Does your book address those kinds of issues?
Yeah, well, I think I look at, I have there's a chapter in there that looks at that, and looking at sort of the variety of breeding that is being done. And I report on that and the variety of ways that that's being done. I think that the genetic modified seed is really only the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to that, and with other kinds of technologies out there. But the points that I make in my book have more to do with sort of understanding where each of these types of efforts play a role or not, and where they could scale up as sort of a buffer resource. I know that one of the pieces around, I read about the submersible rice, or I call it snorkel rice, in Bangladesh, where they've been experiencing these devastating long-term floods, and farmers were able to, or the researchers were able to provide or create a type of rice that could survive being inundated with water for weeks and weeks, when the crop would die otherwise. And so it can live, it can breathe sort of underwater for a period of time. That's providing a resilience tool in an area that's, would have a food crisis otherwise.
I'm going to chime in because it actually just pertains to some notes I have sitting in front of me. You wrote in your book, so Lisa is the source on this, that Bangladesh loses 4 million tons of rice to flooding each year, which would be enough to feed 30 million people. So more snorkel rice does sound like a good idea. Other questions? Yes, and the gentleman over here on the side in the gray.
Yes, my name is Ronald Wilson. I was wondering if you had any idea whether there's an upper limit to how many people the earth can sustain as far as feeding them, and is there an upper limit, or is it ad infinitum?
So many of you are familiar with Bill Butts and Wolfgang Lutz. They're demographers who study this very well, and they had a meeting with them a couple of years ago, and I think they said 20 billion max. But that's, no one's really been able to study that just to truly figure that out. I think that the points that I make in my book have more to do with food systems and how they can adapt and grow. I think that the important piece here to understand many of you may already know this, but it's just the concept of change and how long that takes. And can we make these adaptations and become more resilient amid this changing climate? Floods that we haven't experienced before, or series of floods, or series of heat, or even if it's just a small degree in temperature in tropical areas, is over the long term very difficult to respond to. And so some of these adaptations take a much longer time frame than we're seeing increases in growth. So I think it's that time component of change, and what's the rate of change. Some of these slow onset disasters of drought, for instance, are very difficult to deal with, because we see this incremental change and we suddenly really don't see it until it's almost too late. So there is potentially a parallel.
Certainly not 20 billion Americans, though.
No. Oh, not were you saying American? I didn't know.
No, he didn't say that.
No.
Thank you. Other questions? Just to make sure we get coverage, if there, right up front here, the gentleman in blue.
Yeah, my name's Bob Lawrence. As the population increases and as we have potential climate change, do you foresee the need for extra land that we're going to have to need to grow things on? And if this current land isn't the land that will be arable, what do you foresee?
There's some interesting things that I've been observing around the world. A couple of places, and they're not without, there's debate around what to do with them. There are winners and losers around agriculture and climate change. For instance, Australia, there's parts of Australia that will really suffer great losses. The American Midwest will suffer great losses. Canada, on the other hand, is already increasing their future production, or plans for future production, because they'll be a winner. Same with Russia. Parts of Russia will be now more open to gains in yields than they were before. In terms of land, that arable land, in the Sahel, they're trying a variety of different resilience systems to improve the land that has been eroded from desertification. But that's a difficult nut to crack, because it's going to take a lot of infrastructure and technology to get some of this land back. I think the more efficient crop growth is where it could potentially have a lot of impact. More drip irrigation, that's what I'm seeing in a lot of test plots, as well as innovative irrigation systems. Israel is doing a lot of that are making micro irrigation available to places that didn't have it before. So suddenly these places that were not able to have very much production because of limited resources are now able to have more than they have had previously. So they're able to scale up some of the yields in some of these places that didn't have the kind of yields that they had in the past. So, I think it's going to take all of those efforts to look at to be able to meet this growing demand.
Great. The lady in front up here.
Hello, I'm Cecily Kohler. Do you believe that GMOs are going to be necessary to feed the world population as it expands, or could organic, sustainable practices do the trick?
I don't think that there's a blanket answer for that. I wish there were. But I think that it's going to take a variety of methods, and I think that we don't even know right now what those could be. Right now, some of the more kind of hopeful innovations around that are the people who are looking at the traits from wild crop, sort of wild varieties of the same crop. So it's not necessarily using a different gene from a different crop, but looking at sort of what are some of the resiliencies in these crops that are sort of like the wild variety of rice, or the wild variety of something that has traits to be able to withstand drought or withstand some of these floods that they can look at to be able to make the breeding program more resilient. So I think that from the, I don't necessarily have an opinion on that, because I don't know enough to have an opinion, but I can tell you what I've been reporting out and hearing from other people is that, you know, we're only beginning to scratch the surface of what we can learn and know around the different types of breeding options available to us. But, you know, I don't think that GMOs, for instance, in the United States are going to go away, and that they're necessary, that, you know, and I don't also think that every place in the world will necessarily need them, because, you know, that has a whole cascade of effects. But I think it will take a variety of options, whatever is culturally available to people as well as they can afford. So
you believe they're needed in certain places?
So. No, I'm saying that those are the choices that are available to some places, like in the United States. That's what the American farmer has chosen for the soybean crops, for instance. You know, 90% of the soybean crops, and so if we didn't do that, you know.
If we didn't, yes, that's what I'm trying to get at.
Mm-hmm.
Do we need them?
I believe that they are needed in many places, and I don't see why we wouldn't avail ourselves of the science. But I think, sorry to just chime in, but I think we have a lot of progress to make in terms of public education about transgenic technologies, and it's a complex field, but we could certainly do a better job, I think, to raise those discussions. I don't have expertise in that field, but I've seen their benefits in many places. Kimberly.
My name is Kimberly Flowers. I'm with the CSIS Global Food Security Project. It's really interesting to be on this side this time. It's nice. My question to you is one that's posed to me often, which is, what is your advice to someone as an individual that they can do for better food sustainability? So, you know, when you look at the large global challenges, it can be pretty overwhelming, and we can get into different sort of technical components on all of it. But just as an individual, as a consumer, you know, who lives in a city, you know, what do you recommend that people could do that could help improve the food systems?
Good question. Another question that I could go many directions with. I think the number one thing is I think for people to understand that this is not a simple story. It's okay to know, you know, and to say this is a complex story. I think that people want to know what they can do, you know, just to become more educated about where your food comes from, become more educated about the value. And I think that it's hard, but it's a very difficult thing to navigate. I went to these, you know, and I almost got so sick to my stomach going to past this factory farm that had, I don't even know exactly how many cattle were on there. I had to just count and look and do the math just in my head. But, you know, that was a family farm. You know, so that could be labeled as from a family farm, right? And there's another type of very closed production pork confinement system where they don't use antibiotics. But it was a horrible conditions. But still it's labeled no antibiotics. But it's not sustainable, and it has a number of other issues involved with it. You know, pollution-wise, air pollution-wise, and I could go on. So, you know, I think that there's a lack of, I think that from the consumer's point of view, that I think there could be a greater demand to have more sustainability and more measurement of how the whole system is involved with the production of the foods that they eat. You know, I think that I talked to and this is not in the book, but I recently met with an ag scientist based out of Argentina. And he said that, you know, a lot of Europeans buy their food from Argentina, and they're actually incentivizing a lot of the farmers there to grow organic because they can get higher prices for their European market. And so I think there's been this debate, do I buy local? But if you buy from Argentina organic, that's really helping, because that system could otherwise be a lot worse for the local farmer. So, you know, having this knowledge of what's happening on the local basis for a local farmer is also good. So I think with some of the technology of, you know, these barcode things where you can learn more about where your food is sourced from, you're having greater knowledge about the benefits of buying organic from Argentina, for instance, could be, you know, one of those such instances of
Right.
sort of
And U.S. agricultural policy requires that now, that we can trace it back to the farm.
Right.
Yeah. Other questions? Asma, up here in the front.
Thanks. Asma Latif with Bread for the World. Did you tackle the issue of agriculture's own footprint in terms of climate change and the issues around urbanization in your book?
Yeah, so I didn't do a lot around urbanization, but I'm planning to write more about urbanization. I've got a couple of articles in the works on that. So around that, I think that the footprint of agriculture, I do address that in the book. I think that it comes up in the Climate Smart Agriculture program because they're looking at the contribution of agriculture to climate change as well as how agriculture is being affected by climate change. And so it goes both ways. I think that deforestation is a big issue there, and that's how I focus on it the most, I think, especially the tropical forests.
Thank you. More questions? Oh, suddenly we have a bunch of hands. The gentleman up here in the front. Oh, please just wait for the microphone so that they can hear us online.
Okay, thank you. Hi, I'm Torsten Janos. I just had, did you compare the agricultural sort of options to the Green Revolution, kind of like, because that seems like that was a really big, the Green Revolution was a really big change in agriculture also. Are there any like lessons or anything we should learn from that experience going forward? I mean,
yes.
What, or, oh, sorry.
So I wish I had the slide with me, but I did go to see Norman Borlaug's statue when he had the marigold flowers around his neck in Delhi at the Agricultural Research Center there. So there is a need for this type of revolution, but we don't have it yet. And I think that the agricultural revolution, it will look different. I think we'll have technology involved, but it will be more of the meeting of the minds, of having more people in an integrated way across governments to work together. Because so while we have the Borlaug and the Green Revolution provided the system of inputs. I think we're going to have a system of policies that are needed, and a system of resilience that's needed, and a system of getting everybody at the table that's needed. That's what I believe will be the next piece of this.
I agree. Other questions? Here in the middle, the gentleman with the yellow tie. That's you.
Thank you. In the previous century, I was on the oversight committee of the CGIAR, and Borlaug used to come to those meetings, and he used to say, the next green revolution, as opposed to the one associated with my name, will not involve any of the crops that I worked on. And you mentioned deforestation, and he talked about the orphan crops that the CGIAR was not working on. That is to say, perennial crops. Like the peach palm, which the conquistadores used to cut down so that the Indians would work in the mine instead of going back into the jungle to eat. And these are still pretty much orphan crops. And when you go to a lot of ag research planning meetings, it's never said explicitly, but these are women's crops. And most, even today, of the decision makers at those meetings, at least on the developing country side, are male. And they know very well it's a huge empowerment opportunity to feed people without deforestation. And I don't know if your book would be a great book to kind of hit that nail.
Oh,
and maybe it does. Maybe it does. Well, good. I'll buy one. Then, but that, looking back on the Borlaug era, and I was a graduate student when that was all kicking in, the Green Revolution, and this archaeology is not really brought in. And it's not because people don't know it, but generally the people pushing gender empowerment don't get away from annual crops. And granaries are a way of controlling people. And you have patriarchal societies with granaries. And when there's tree crops that produce a starchy staple, you have matrilocal societies. And a lot of government people, unlike donor people, donor agronomists, know this, and they don't want it to happen in their country. And yet you cannot feed people and have the forests as well.
So
That was a question, actually.
Okay, so the question is, what I'm going to respond to you is, yes, I get into that in multiple levels in the book. One of the African Role University for Women is one of the pieces that I looked at because of that reason, because it is a women-to-women education component, but also providing them with leadership skills. You know, they've got radio shows because radio is really big where that is, you know, in their communities, and as well as, you know, places in, and I can't remember, I think it was, well, it's Latin America, around some of the agroforestry perennial crops. But having these women's empowerment issues embedded in some of the work has been done. And that's part of this Climate Smart Villages program that they have. Actually, yesterday I was just emailing back with a researcher, a social scientist who's working on this very issue. She was measuring some of the decisions. She had the women, and this is in India, a very patriarchal society, had some of the women doing journaling around like what was done each day or what was done each week at the farm. And they actually found that they had a lot more decision-making power on the farm than they thought they did. So some of this, but having, you know, that type of thinking and understanding where some of the decisions are being made in marginalized countries and where women are marginalized, will be, I think, a huge component for food security for women and children.
Great. I confess I had lost track of the time. I was so interested in the questions. I think we'll take one more, if you'll permit me, 2 minutes over, and then I want to make sure that Lisa also has a chance to share some additional information. I guess the gentleman up here in the gray.
Michael Swoboda, George Washington University. What recent innovations, advances in feeding the planet are most at risk under the current administration?
Oh boy. You know, I think from that perspective, it seems to be such a day-to-day turn. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I wish I did, although we all wish we did, right? I think that's been, from the people that I'm talking to, they're going, you know, the U.S. institutions, the Landgrant Schools, I can talk to that. The Landgrant Schools have a place, and they have a research component in them that will be needed in the future. And I think that's one of the reasons that they are also looking at developing partnerships that are not only with their business leaders, but also NGOs and folks working on nutrition to make the crops be more, I guess, resilient to the changes that are coming.
I think we do all wish that we knew more.
Yes.
And we'll all know more next week.
Will.
So, Lisa, I think you wanted to
share
additional information.
You know, I know that a lot of people ask me about the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, where I am a fellow. I think just to briefly summarize what the center does, it's a center that's funded by the National Science Foundation to the University of Maryland. And so the center brings together the science of the natural world with the science of human behavior and decision making to look for solutions to some of these environmental problems that have a human component. And so in doing so, the center has many types of themes that they have calls for proposals. They like to have decision makers, policy makers, people in academia in some of the research teams that they have there, because they feel that having everybody at the table looking at the problem and asking the questions from the get-go means that they don't have they've sort of like taken the blinders off, so they know, what some of the people who are actually making the decisions on the front end might need to know from the research side. So having the research to better inform decision making at whatever level, whether it's something that's being done at a regional level, environmental renovation, or a large-scale global restoration project of magnitude. And they also offer a variety of postdoctoral fellowships. So if anyone here is tied to academia, just wanted to pass that on there. One specifically, there's another, a variety of them coming up. There includes the fellowship to model the impacts of climate variability on the nutritional value of crops and potential effects on human health and well-being. So it just gives you a sense of the type of research that's being done there. There's a soy supply chain research pursuit that's happening there. There's a research pursuit that's looking around the Climate Smart Villages program in India. It comes at it from all perspectives. And so for me, it provides me with not only scholarship to help inform some of the research that I do, but also just a great variety of people that I run across every day.
Great. So should people reach out to you if they're interested in engaging, or what's the best way? You can look on the website.
Yeah, I
to find
think
out more
probably
information, I guess?
subscribe to the newsletter.
Okay.
They're succinct.org, SESYNC.org is the website, and the newsletter will keep you informed of all the upcoming calls for proposals and opportunities.
Perfect, thank you. Well, I know there were still questions that have gone unanswered. Fortunately, we have a reception right here and right now. So let's keep that conversation going with some snacks and some beverages. And thank you all so much for joining us today.
Thank you.